What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, the GOAT Magnus Carlsen disrespects Gukesh D with the Norwegian Rat Opening at the 2022 Speed Chess Championships. Now, in the game, Gukesh D is playing as white. He opens 1e4 best by test, and Magnus Carlsen goes 1g6 the modern defense. Now, Gukesh on move 2, d4, so far so good, taking control of the center. And now here, the main idea for black, of course, will be bishop g7. However, on move 2, Magnus Carlsen throws a big curveball in this game. He doesn't go bishop g7. Instead, he plays the Norwegian Rat Opening with the move knight to f6. And yes, this move does define the Norwegian Rat, I'm assuming named after Magnus Carlsen himself, the Norwegian chess player. Alright, what's the idea? Well, it's sort of a mix between the Alekhines opening and the modern defense. Overall, you are putting pressure on that pawn on e4, but you do invite the idea of e5, pressuring the knight on f6, and overall, this line is just not very good for black. Alright, here, Gukesh, what is he going to do? Again, e5 is the main idea. However, instead of that, he just goes knight to c3, allowing a transposition back to the Pirc defense if Magnus wants it. So, for example, d6 would be a Pirc defense on the board, but again, Magnus Carlsen, he's not in the mood for that. He plays in the spirit of the Norwegian Rat Opening, and he goes d5, breaking in the center. Another dubious idea, but that is just how Magnus Carlsen rolls. Alright, now, e5 on the board, that move being virtually forced if you want to fight for an advantage. And now here, Magnus, his knight on f6 is being attacked. Where does it go? Well, it turns out there are a variety of decent squares. Surprisingly, knight to h5 is playable. Normally that move is not a good idea as g4 would trap the knight. However, that g7 square is available and knight g7 would be a decent retreat. Instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen, he does find the strongest idea, simply knight to e4, jumping in with the knight to the e4 square. Alright, what's the idea? Well, technically you can trade knights. Knight takes e4 is possible. However, once you trade the knights and black goes d takes e4, that pawn is a nuisance in your position and it is very hard to win back. For example, if you go queen to e2, then queen takes d4 would win the newly undefended pawn on the d4 square. So overall, knight takes e4 is very playable, but it's also very, very tricky. Now in the game, Gukesh, he does not play that. Instead, he goes knight c to e2. The idea being now he is ready to drive back that knight on e4 with the move f3 at some point. Then the knight will have to retreat. And from there, you just do continue developing with a very good game as white. Alright, here, Magnus, what's his idea? Well, in this position, he makes a move that would make Ben Finegold himself blush. He actually plays f6, the Ben Finegold counterattack on the board, and the idea being he wants to chop down on that very strong pawn on the 5 square. Now here, Gukesh, if he takes on f6, e takes f6, then knight takes f6, wins back the pawn, and the knight is very well placed on the f6 square. So here, Gukesh, he doesn't want to allow that. That plays right into Magnus Carlsen's hands. So with that in mind, what should he be doing here? Well, he has a wide variety of very playable ideas. For example, bishop e3 is good, f3 is good, and so on. But instead here, Gukesh, he finds the most aggressive move available in this position. He plays the alpha 0 move, h4, expanding on the kingside, and now the threat is simply h5, and then h takes g6, trying to blow open the kingside and at least win a pawn. Alright, Magnus, what's he going to do in response? Well, he starts f takes e5, the whole idea of the Ben Finegold counterattack, taking on e5 with the pawn, trying to damage white's pawn structure. Now here, instead of d takes e5, Gukesh actually goes f3 immediately, a much stronger idea, driving back the knight and not allowing d takes e5, then knight to c6, putting pressure on the pawn immediately. Alright, now, where is the knight going to go? Well, it's actually very tricky. If you go back to f6, then d takes e5 hits the knight with tempo. Instead of that, Magnus does go knight to d6. However, this runs into the exact same problem. Here, d takes e5 does hit the knight once again. The knight has to go somewhere. And now, where is the best square for the knight? Well, it turns out there are a number of decent ideas. For example, knight to c4 surprisingly is playable, putting pressure on that pawn on e5. Knight to f5 also playable. Instead, in the game, Magnus does go knight to f7, retreating the knight and putting pressure on that pawn on e5 once again. Alright, here, Gukesh, he finds the strongest idea, f4, expanding on the kingside, bolstering that pawn on the 5 square with the f pawn. Now, Magnus, Knight to c6, a solid idea, getting the knight out to the very best square in the game. And surprisingly, you actually don't want to go bishop g7 right away. It turns out it is much better to develop the queen side and get those active pieces into the game as fast as you can. All right, here, Gukesh D. He is not done. He's not slowing down. He actually advances the h-pawn on the king side up to the h5 square. So h5 on the board. Again, this move would make AlphaZero himself blush if he was a human and could blush. He's an engine. He can't. But still, the idea is the same. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen. He's under a lot of pressure. H takes g6 is being threatened. What do you want to do about it? Well, the strongest idea here, believe it or not, you ignore that threat and just go bishop g4, again developing your queen side. If you want to, you can even follow up queen d7 and long castles in the future, and the king would be relatively safe on the queen side. However, instead of that, here, Magnus Carlsen, he expands on the king side with the move g5. Very interesting. Now, this move does give up that pawn on g5 if Gukesh wants it. However, the problem with that, if you go f takes g5, then the pawn on e5 will be undefended. So g5 trying to remove the defender of the e5 pawn. That way, if f takes, then knight f or knight c takes e5 will be the response. All right, Gukesh here, in this position, he simply ignores the threat of g takes f4, and he just goes knight to f3, a very strong idea. The idea being if Magnus takes on f4, then you go bishop takes f4, and suddenly that pawn on e5 will be defended twice by the bishop on f4 and the knight on f3. And beyond that, you just keep developing with tempo. So, very good idea. Now the threat is knight takes g5, and Magnus will have to respond. All right, in the game, he doesn't go g takes f4, he doesn't go bishop g4, or any other typical idea. He actually continues the advance of the pawn with the move g4. And surprisingly, this idea is very, very dangerous. I mean, just imagine in the future if Magnus goes e6 and then threatens bringing the queen out on this diagonal. That could be very dangerous and very fast for Gukesh. All right, here in this position, knight f d4 is the move for Gukesh, centralizing the knight. Now we do have some knight traits. Knight takes d4 and knight takes d4 on the board. You don't want to allow knight takes c6 damaging the queenside pawn structure, so overall, very good idea by Magnus. All right, here, in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he still has the problem of how to develop his kingside. If he goes bishop g7 right away, that could run into a very fast h6 idea. So instead of that, he actually goes knight to h6, blocking the h5 pawn in its place and threatening potentially knight to f5 at some point. So, very interesting idea. Now here, Gukesh, for some reason the computer likes the idea of c3. If you can understand why c3 is the best move over, say, developing the bishops, let me know in the comment section below. This one really puzzled me by the engine, but instead, bishop d3 on the board, a very logical looking move, developing the bishop and putting pressure on that h7 point, that being a very weak point in the black position. All right, now, Magnus Carlsen, c5, expanding on the queen side, very standard idea, and now Gukesh, he jumps in with the bishop once again, this time to b5. Bishop b5 on the board, the idea being c6 blocking the check is no longer possible, so now this diagonal is weakened, so bishop b5 does make a lot of sense. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, in this position, he literally goes off the deep end. Typically here, when you have the bishop on b5, you would go bishop d7 just trying to block the check. The very logical idea. However, instead, Magnus Carlsen, he goes king to f7, bringing his king over to the king side and basically artificially castling. Now, this move is not particularly good, but I don't know if it's Magnus Carlsen thinking it was the best move or just showing his typical flair in this game. I mean, he did start with the Norwegian Rat Opening after all, so anything is possible here. All right, and by the way, Chess YouTube, if you're enjoying this video, smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. All right, here, Gukesh, in this position, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out with that king on f7, everything changes. You have all sorts of very aggressive ideas that you can play. For example, e6, the pawn sacrifice, is playable. Even f5, the other pawn sacrifice, is playable, threatening e6 on the next move. However, instead of those stronger ideas, here Gukesh, he goes knight to b3, getting his knight out of attack. Of course, that c-pawn was putting pressure on the knight, but you had the option of ignoring it and starting the attack on the king side again with f5 or e6. And now, after knight to b3, here Magnus Carlsen, he finds a series of very precise moves. He starts bishop f5, getting his bishop out into the game. And now here, Gukesh, he actually castles on the king side, short castles on the board, and this turns out to be a very critical mistake. Here, Magnus Carlsen, believe it or not, his king is actually pretty safe on f7, and Gukesh's king on g1 is actually going to come under fire. Here, Magnus, e6 is the move, a fantastic idea, opening up this diagonal for the queen. And now the threat is queen to h4, then g3, and then queen to h2 checkmate. And what is Gukesh going to do about it? Well, in the game, he doesn't do anything to stop it. He starts bishop e2, retreating the bishop, but this bishop does very little on the e2 square. And now Magnus Carlsen, queen to h4, jumping in with the queen, and again, the threat is simply g3, and then queen to h2, and there's very little Gukesh can do to stop it. Now, real fast, is it even possible to stop Magnus Carlsen's attack in this position? Well, the answer is yes, but it is not pretty. Here's how it works. You start bishop to e3, then g3 by Magnus, then you have to go rook to f3. The idea being after queen to h2, you slide your king over to the f1 square, and then if queen to h1, you go bishop g1. And technically, yes, you are defending for now. However, there are so many threats. You can follow up bishop e4, rook g8, knight g4, c4, and so on as black. And for that reason, Gukesh D, way back in this position, he simply resigned on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his Norwegian Rat Opening and subsequent attack in this game. Wow, what a game. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen played yet another unstoppable attack against Gukesh D. If you enjoyed this game, you're going to love that one, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.